Well, good evening and welcome to Ask a Bishop. And this evening our topic is the ritual reason why. So what I'm looking for are questions that you may have about liturgical practice, about devotional customs or pious customs. Perhaps you've wondered why this or that is done here, then, or whenever. So now is your time, your opportunity to ask. For those of you who are not familiar with this format, I'll just explain that we're trying to be as live and interactive as possible. All you have to do is type your question in the comments, and it will appear hopefully before me, and I will give answer to it. So let's just check that everyone can hear. So if you could all just press your thumbs up icon, please, the like button, just to let me know that everyone can hear me. Lovely. Okay. And now I'm, of course, am broadcasting from Brighton in the United Kingdom. Now I know some of you are from far and distant places, some as far away as Pompeii, meaning Portsmouth, not Italy. Some of you nearer to home, literally just over the valley behind me. Some of you from America, and even I think from the Philippines there, so Macedonia as well. So just for a minute, type in the comments where you're from, where you're watching from. And in part, this is just to check that I will see your comments. Lovely, Los Angeles, Macedonia. America again. Texas, I think. Lovely. Okay, so has anybody got a burning question about devotional or liturgical praxis that they'd like to ask? Who's going to start us off? Perhaps while people are formulating their questions, I'll just give a bit of background to myself. I was more or less spoon-fed the liturgy from an early age. Particularly my interest is in the traditional Latin rite. I have a smattering of knowledge about the Eastern Rite, and I know enough about the modern Rite to prefer the traditional Rite myself. But it looks like Darren has asked us a question. Okay, Darren, do you want to try that question again in English? I can't understand. Oh, I see. Right, I understand. So Darren's asking why in the sacristy are the vestments laid out in a particular way. In fact, they're laid out in a particular order and in a particular way. The order that they're laid out in is for ease of the priest putting them on. So they begin with the first garment, which is the garment that will be underneath everything else. And that is, of course, the amice. The prayer that accompanies that talks about the helmet of salvation. And that essentially is a kind of neck cloth, which is worn around the neck. Properly speaking, it's tucked in to the collar around the priest's neck. And the idea is that the amice will protect the vestments from the sweat of the priest. That's effectively what an amice does. So an amice is usually washable, usually made of a cotton or a linen, and it is worn, as I say, around the neck. It actually crosses over, and there are long ribbons which cross the priest's chest, go around his waist, and tie up again at the front in a bow. Now, in some places, the custom is when the amice is laid out, there's no set way, as it were, for the amice to be laid out. Often it's laid out as a kind of cover over the pile of vestments, and some ingenious sacristans are able to create all sorts of wonderful monograms and things out of the ribbons, because the ribbons are so long, because they have to go around the chest and around the waist and back to the front again. And I've seen some amazing pictures of miracles wrought by nuns who have recreated all sorts of monograms and and little pictures, holy pictures. I think the most amazing one was one nun had arranged the ribbons in such a way as to create a kind of icon of the Blessed Virgin with the ribbon ties. Really quite ingenious. There is no need for that. There is no kind of other than personal taste or ingenuity, we might say. So the amice goes on, is the first vestment that goes on. After the amice comes the alb, meaning white, and the alb really speaks, it's a robe of purity. It descends in practice all the way from the Old Testament as the base garment of the high priest and the priests in the temple. It also symbolizes the baptismal robe of the catechumen when they are being baptized. So it speaks to the purity of the Christian, or the desired purity of the Christian. So the alb, which is a long white tunic, goes over the top of the amice. Albs come in various different patterns. Sometimes they have the more traditional is what we call a gathered yoke around the neckline. Some have a boxed pleat neckline. They're often referred to by the ecclesiastical outfitters as the Roman alb. Sometimes you see pretty horrific excuses for an alb known as a cassock alb, which has a collar, has a sort of Nero collar, rather like a cassock does. But such are really to be eschewed. they are a vestment that is supposed to compromise the priest not having to wear a cassock underneath everything. That's where the notion of a cassock alb came from, but it's quite an alien thing to tradition. And albs can be embroidered, apparelled, or lace. Embroidered albs, that means that on the cuff there may be some stitched embroidery, and again around the hem of the cassock. Sometimes these are just lines of colour. Sometimes they are an intricate design. They may be of sacred objects or vessels, again maybe the monogram IHS, whatever, but embroidered albs. Embroidered albs are usually worn too in Advent and Lent. So in traditional churches and chapels, where perhaps on the continent ordinarily they would wear lace albs to demonstrate the sobriety of the two penitential seasons of Advent and Lent, often they will forsake the lace alb and instead wear an embroidered alb, perhaps with purple or violet stitching to reflect the liturgical colour of the season. Then the apparelled alb is a large white alb, usually with a gathered yoke, and this stems from the Old English tradition, sometimes known as the Sarum use or the Sarum rite. Really, properly speaking, it's a Sarum use because it is a use of the Latin rite or the Roman rite or the Western rite, meaning that the Sarum rite, the Sarum use was a variation of the Roman rite. At one time, before the Council of Trent, so before 1570, there was quite a wide variety of ways in which the Latin rite was employed. Variations according to region, sometimes according to diocese, between the religious orders, and even between the houses of the religious orders. They all had slight variations as to the way in which they offered Mass. So the apparelled alb comes to us from the medieval period, when really it was fairly widely used, and not just in the Sarum use, but today it's generally confined to the Sarum use. And an apparel was a square box of fine material that was placed on the front and of the back of the alb towards the bottom of the alb, not quite on the hem, a little above the hem, and the apparels again could be extremely ornate, very ornately decorated, or they could just be fairly plain, often in liturgical colours, not necessarily the same colour as the chasuble, which we'll come to in a moment. Sometimes, particularly medieval, if you look at medieval paintings and pictures, you will often see that in the vestments sometimes there is quite a contrast between, certainly between the use today, where the use of colours today is fairly standardised, particularly in the West. In medieval times, sometimes it was quite a mix and match. Generally, that came down to what various churches, chapels, or cathedrals could afford, what was available locally to them in terms of trade, in terms of trained seamstresses, etc. So it was not unusual in medieval times sometimes for the full Mass vestments of a priest not to match, or at least not to match in the way that we today kind of generally uniformly prefer. So the apparels would be, as I say, on the front and back, the lower portion of the alb. Sometimes too, they might be a cuff, and also too, a neck apparel. So it would be attached to the amice, and so you'd have a coloured cloth there around the neck of the priest. There is a similar style in the Ambrosian Rite and in the name is the Gallican Rite or Gallican use in France. Various different places there used to use similar vestments, and it was on the tip of my tongue then, and the same in Spain. So that's the apparelled alb. And then lastly, lace albs. So the custom arose particularly in the hotter countries of southern Europe for albs to be made of lace. Originally it began as a form of decoration, and so was sort of just on the hem or just on the cuffs, and then gradually it became deeper and deeper, so that it is possible today even to find an alb that is completely lace. There was at one time an effort to standardize the use of lace so that only particular ranks of clergy wore particular lengths of lace, but in recent years, certainly since the 70s and the new rite in Rome, the contemporary Novus Ordo, those sort of rules or customs have gone by the by. There is a contemporary equivalent to the lace alb, which is a cotta with what is sometimes called lace inserts or box thread. So a kind of a modern equivalent of lace, usually where in the sleeve of the cotta, for example, they leave the hem, and then they might, as it were, they don't cut out holes, as it were, but they kind of draw threads together and make a pattern of them in a band around the cuff and around the hem of the cotta. So that's the alb. So yes, that's the alb, or indeed the cotta. Cottas as well are also subject to the same forms of decoration. So the alb, and then after the alb, the sacristan will have arranged the vestments in one of two ways. If a maniple is being used, then the following vestments will be arranged to make the monogram IHS. So the next vestments to be worn are the stole, the maniple, and the girdle, or the cincture, as it's sometimes called, which is the rope that the priest ties around his waist as a sign of symbol of chastity. The stole represents the yoke, one being yoked to the service of Christ, and the maniple represents service. Now these three things are arranged in such a way that they make the monogram IHS. In the contemporary modern Roman use, where the maniple is not used, then the stole and the cincture will be arranged to make the monogram Alpha and Omega, meaning beginning and end, symbols used for Christ. You may have noticed on the Paschal candle that often Alpha and Omega appear in the decoration. Today that's largely a hangover from the more traditional rite on Paschal Vigil, when the the candle would be inscribed. But anyway, I'm digressing. And usually for the Alpha and Omega, when you're looking at the vestments after they've been laid, it'll be the girdle that makes the shape of Omega, which is the last letter in the Greek alphabet, and underneath it you will see the stole arranged to make the letter A. In the more traditional form, you will find that the maniple has been laid straight up. The cincture will have been arranged to make an S, and the stole underneath it will have been arranged to look like an H. So there you have the IHS for the monogram of Jesus the Christ, the initials. Then underneath those there is the chasuble, and the chasuble literally means a little house, casula, and it looks generally like a poncho. So it's a large enveloping vestment. However, of course, there is also the cut-down version, known as the fiddleback. Now, both the full version and the cut-down version come in a myriad of styles and shapes, which is really too much to go into right now, but they reflect organic development, we might say, in the tradition and customs, and even to some extent the use of the vestments. They particularly reflect a regional use and variation, so that, for example, in Northern Europe, large Gothic or canonical chasubles were de rigueur, in the north being much colder than in the south, where often the much more cut down version of the chasuble became popular, like the fiddleback. So the fiddleback is often associated with continental Europe and the south particularly, whereas the Gothic shaped chasuble is redolent of the north. So those are the vestments, and that's why and how they are arranged in that way. So we've got another question from Alistair. Good evening, Alistair. What practices from other Christian denominations or even other religions do you particularly appreciate? Let me see if I can... You might have to do part 2 of your question again for me, Alistair, because this won't let me... It says see more, but I can't press see more. Or if I press see more, it doesn't do anything. So I'll answer the first part while you type perhaps the second part of your question there. So what practices from other Christian denominations or even other religions do you particularly appreciate? That's a good question. I think in the West, what we can't generally avoid in the West in terms of liturgical and worship tradition, even and despite the radical attempts at differentiating approach and theology, so between, for example, the evangelicals and the Catholics, even so, there's a lot of crossover, between the two, especially today. You know, whereas at one time, somebody who was a Protestant minister, in the middle of the 20th century, a Protestant minister would be unlikely to be seen in any type of kind of vestment at all. However, a more traditional Protestant minister would probably wear what was known as the Geneva gown, or to what we in the UK and the USA would liken to an academic gown. And often this would be worn with preaching bands and by high Protestant ministers of religion, sometimes they would wear a cassock underneath it as well. Nowadays, Protestant ministers are just as happy, it seems, to wear stoles and albs. They usually wear the cassock alb variety, and even chasubles, so even Eucharistic vestments. And this is, slightly ironic concerning their doctrine and belief, supposedly about Holy Communion. But I'm digressing here. What do I appreciate from other practices? On the first off, I particularly appreciate the personal piety and expressive piety of our Eastern brethren. In the West, for example, we tend to make the sign of the cross fairly rarely, only at particular times in the liturgy, only perhaps at particular times outside of the liturgy. Whereas one of the things I love and appreciate about our Eastern brethren is they'll use and make the sign of the cross practically at any given time or opportunity. It's quite striking for a Western Catholic to observe Eastern practices, and of course I remember the first time I went and observed Eastern Orthodox worship. I was intrigued by all the signs of the crosses that were being made by everyone, and there didn't seem to be, I couldn't work out whether it was a particular phrase or at a particular invitation by the priest that everybody made the sign of the cross. And it seemed that some people would make one sign of the cross, some people would make 3 signs of the cross, other people seemed to be making the sign of the cross all the time. It was really quite puzzling, and so I asked, what's the deal? And basically I was told, well, it's personal piety. Yes, there are various times in the liturgy when the sacred ministers in the Eastern rites are required to make the sign of the cross, but otherwise the rest is down to personal piety. And hence then the wide variation between our Orthodox brethren in that praxis. And again, of course, there are regional variations, local variations, as well as one's personal piety. But I love the fact, I love that expression of devotion and recognition of our salvation. And in many ways, I would say, I would commend the sign of the cross as a tool for living in holy fear, which I spoke about a couple of days ago. But it's making the sign of the cross reminds us, puts us in mind and in the presence of the Blessed Trinity and of the Godhead. So that's a particular practice that I appreciate. Otherwise, as a practice from other religions, I quite like the custom of joss sticks or incense sticks, prevalent in Asia. As a good Latin Rite Catholic, I have a great fondness and appreciation for incense generally. There's nothing quite like it to create an ambience of holiness and to have clouds of incense everywhere. But incense, of course, is generally in the West reserved to liturgical use, and even then is quite prescribed as to how it's used and when it's used. Whereas incense sticks or joss sticks in the East are used by anyone, anywhen, anywhere. and of course, one of the things about incense is the imagery, the allegory, as it were, of our prayers being represented by the ascending smoke. And you'll notice in the Far East that they tend to use incense sticks or joss sticks in much the same way as we use candles for votiva. So if you've been to you're all familiar, I'm sure, with people lighting candles before icons and statues here in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, they tend to burn joss sticks and incense sticks as for the same reason as votiva, in representation of their prayers. So if there was something I was ever going to commend people to use, it would be incense sticks and joss sticks in private devotion, to remind us of our prayers ascending to heaven. And I've just seen your second part. That's a funny question, Alistair. What change has there been in Western Orthodoxy over the last century? Well, we wouldn't be Orthodox if there had been much change. There's the old question, was it how many Orthodox clergy does it take to change a light bulb? And there are two answers. One is change, and the other is light bulb. So forgive me if your question is meant in a serious way. What changes there been in Western Orthodoxy over the last century? Well, probably more people becoming aware of Western Orthodoxy, and certainly more people converting to Western Orthodoxy. In terms of liturgical and change and praxis, not a lot. I mean, there are, I suppose, identifiably three streams of, with over 1,000, yes, all right, Alistair, I'll come to that. Three streams currently of Western Orthodoxy. There is the old calendarist, Western Orthodox, who use the old Julian calendar, and use pre-Reformation liturgies. So numbered among them would be the Sarum Use. Then there are the old Romans, of which I'm one, who would tend to use the traditional Latin rite as it was in the 19th century, to be properly speaking, up until 1909. In 1910, Pius X, rather ironically, as he is given as the patron and named as the patron of a traditionalist Catholic priestly society, but it was Pius X who really started mucking around with the Roman liturgy and began, as it were, the process of modernization that has resulted in the Novus Ordo today. So Western Orthodox old Romans would, as it were, observe a kind of cut-off point of 1909. That's also when Archbishop Matthew published the first Old Catholic Missal in the vernacular. And then the third stream are the Antiochian and Russian Orthodox Western Rite, who use a Byzantized version of, some use pre-Reformation liturgy, some use post-Reformation liturgy, some use pre-schism liturgy. There's quite a wide variety of praxis amongst them, but all of them use a Byzantized, we might say, hybrid of Western liturgy. So in other words, they've inserted prayers or customs from the East into the Western liturgy. As for as for what changes there have been for Western Orthodoxy in 1,000 years, again, I refer you to my first answer. I suppose in that sense, then the Byzantinization of some Western liturgy by some Western Orthodox, I suppose, that would be the biggest change, really, in even 1,000 years. You see, the traditional Latin rite has really been unchanged for about 1,500 years. The Tridentine codification by Pius V really just standardized how the Roman liturgy was offered and celebrated. And essentially they just adopted what was the practice at Rome and extended it to everywhere else. But even then, when St. Pius V, as it were, promulgated that codification of the Latin liturgy, he did so with the caveat that all previous uses of 200 years prior to his decree were permissible, were still allowable. Now, the great shame, to some extent, is that most people adopted then the Roman use of the Latin rite. And the regional variations began to disappear or go out of use. In England, of course, by the time of Henry VIII's Reformation, the Sarum use was the most widely used form of the Latin rite. However, it wasn't exclusive. Most cathedrals had their own uses. The Sarum rite, of course, meaning Salisbury, but there was a use at Bangor, at Hereford, at Worcester, at Durham, at York. They all had, as it were, regional variations. And in theory, all of those could have continued and perhaps would have continued here in the UK if it hadn't been for the Reformation. But instead, because of the outlawing of Catholics and the Catholic religion, those recusant priests, so those English Catholic priests, young men who were still willing to answer God's call to become priests for England, were of course trained on the continent, and therefore tended, and in the first instance were trained primarily in Rome before Dowie was set up, and so they adopted the Roman use and the Roman way of doing things, which was pretty much the death knell for the Sarum use and the other regional variations of the Latin rite that had been common in England before the Reformation. I mean, there has been and there are attempts now to revive the Sarum use. When Catholic emancipation occurred in England in 1830, when by the time Westminster Cathedral, the new Westminster Cathedral, had been built, the notion had been suggested of adopting the Sarum use for the cathedral, but this was rejected. Which is a shame, but nonetheless, that's the case. Yes, so that's that, as it were, on Western Orthodoxy. Thank you, Alistair, for your question. Darren, you've got another question. What about the Latin on our rings? out. Not quite sure what you mean by that, Darren. I mean, Latin inscriptions have been on rings for centuries, and certainly, usually, the people who put the inscriptions on the rings and the people who asked them to put the inscriptions on the rings knew what the inscriptions meant. So I don't quite know what you mean by why did it take so long for people to work out. Perhaps you can unpick that one for me. If you've just joined us, welcome, Leonardo, welcome. So we're taking questions today about the liturgy, or about devotional customs and praxis. So welcome, Father Nicholas. Good to see you. So if you have any questions about liturgical or devotional praxis, that's what we're discussing this evening. So already we've discussed vestments, Eucharistic vestments, and the way in which they are laid out in the sacristy, and why and what their meaning is, what their symbolism is. We've discussed developments or non-developments in Western Orthodoxy over the past century and 1,000 years. So we've discussed things like the Sarum Rite and things like that. So this is just a recap for people who've just joined us. No, Darren, and then Darren was just asking about Latin inscriptions on rings. To be honest, Darren, no. If people have always known what the instructions were. I got told about the devotion of St. Benedict and that the meanings were lost. No, they're not. The inscriptions on the Benedictine medal, on the medal of St. Benedict, there's various words and, of course, abbreviations and monograms. They're all known and have always been known. It's not something that the Benedictine order, after 1,500 years, is likely to forget. And you can certainly look up online. I know of at least one diagram of the Benedictine medal which explains all the various parts and all the inscriptions and all the abbreviations and monograms contained within it, as well as a description and explanation of the cross itself that's used, and of course the imagery of St. Benedict. So you can look that up on Google. Does anybody else have a burning question, something they've always wanted to know about traditional Catholic devotional or liturgical praxis? Yes, Darren, that phrase just simply means the Holy Cross of St. Benedict. Latin, we know what Latin is and what it means. That tradition has not been lost. Some parts of the church may have lost it because they rejected it or just stopped learning it, but anyone with a grasp of Latin can interpret the Benedictine medal. Anyone else? Any other questions? Deacon Felix, okay, so you use the Western rite for Eucharistic liturgy, but you use the Byzantine rite for the office. Is that what you're saying? Well, personally, privately, as a devotional tool, you can use whatever you like. If you are a incardinated canonical Western Orthodox Old Roman cleric, then you would have to use the liturgies as prescribed by canon law. So in the Orthodox Old Roman Communion, for example, one would be expected to use the Roman breviary or the monastic diurnal to recite the offices in order to fulfill the canonical obligation of clerics to recite those prayers. But as a personal and private devotion, of course, that's up to you. Rather than, so a question from Father Nicholas, circumcision of Christ. Now that's a good question, Father. So Father Nicholas asks, why did the Second Vatican Council change the feast of the 1st of January to Mary the Mother of God rather than return to the feast of the circumcision? Well, strictly speaking, it wasn't the Second Vatican Council that made that change, but rather the Bernini Committee under the supposed aegis of Paul VI, that in implementing the spirit of the suggestions made by the Council, and this, of course, is the great controversy between, I mean, even Marcel Lefebvre signed off on most of the documents of the Second Vatican Council as one of the Conciliar Fathers, including, I believe, Sacrosanctum Concilium, or Sacrosanctum Concilium, the dogmatic constitution on the liturgy. But it was the interpretation by Bernini and others after the council had finished, where Marcel Lefebvre would say the rot set in, because that's when they took the widest possible interpretation of the Conciliar Fathers to manipulate things to their way of doing things. Now, the tradition of commemorating Our Lady on New Year's Day goes way back when. And of course, you will know that Lady Day last week, as the Feast of the Annunciation, was at one time the new civic year. It was the new year for the civic calendar, technically New Year's Day. And I think that's essentially what they were thinking of. I mean, by extrapolation, of course, or by extension, they talk about beginning the new year under the patronage of Our Lady. But of course, in the old calendar, and according to the old rite, we would argue that with the Feast of the Circumcision, we are beginning the year remembering our own Saviour's subjugation to the covenant with God, and that indeed the Methodists, for example, usually have their covenant service around the time of New Year, where they formally, as it were, renew their commitment as Christians to the gospel. And so it would seem, from a traditional perspective, of course, it's wholly appropriate that, of course, because the Feast of the Circumcision, the tradition of the Jews was for circumcision to take place on the octave day following the birth of a male child. So in that respect, Joseph and Mary had no choice in that. And of course, for us, it reminds us that Christ himself subjected, humbled himself, excuse me, in humbling himself, included accepting God's will, and he subjected himself to the law in the same way that we all should, as if to suggest that he wasn't exempt, as it were, from it. And that's a good lesson, a good reminder for many of us to begin the new year with. Also, too, of course, is that the circumcision speaks to the first shedding of Christ's blood. In fact, some theologians used to opine that the circumcision itself was enough to redeem the world, in the sense of that pure blood in sacrifice. But I'm digressing again. So I think, Father Nicholas, to answer your question, I think the thinking of Bernini et al. Remember that they had a false kind of faux archaeological approach to the liturgy, so that they claimed more often than not that they were appealing to earlier customs and traditions regarding the changes that they were making to the Mass and to the rubrics. So I think in Bernini et al.'s mind, they were thinking of the tradition previously of New Year's Day coinciding with Lady Day, which they then gave an interpretation of placing the new year under Our Lady's patronage. That's a good question. I have a big tome here somewhere of by Bernini in his own words. I might actually look that up and see if it says anything in there about that change for you. Well, I won't do that now, of course. Right, well, we've come. That's time, I'm afraid. Fathers and others, thank you for your kind attention. I hope my answers were sufficient for thee. If you just give a flurry of thumbs up if I covered everything and you understood what I said. Thank you, Father, for the question. Okay, right, bless you all. Right, so that's the end of this evening's episode. Tomorrow, now don't forget to look out for it on the Brighton Oratory Facebook page. There was a poll today as to what tonight's topic would be. I will post another poll tomorrow for tomorrow's topic. So today was the choice between sense and sensibility, or the ritual reason why. So tomorrow, again, sense and sensibility, which at one point was leading in the poll, that will be offered again tomorrow with another alternative choice. So look out for the poll. If you have suggestions for topics for Q&A, please feel free to write them in the comments or private message me with them, and I will certainly give them serious consideration. Otherwise, next broadcast, of course, is Mass tomorrow at 8:30, followed by the midday Angelus, then the evening Angelus, and tomorrow night's episode of Ask a Bishop. So God bless you all. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see many of you tomorrow.